Josh Harper pulled into the driveway of his mother's charming suburban home, the kind of house that screamed cozy family dinners. It was a typical Sunday evening, and he assumed this would be another meal filled with Carol Harper's famous roast chicken and well-meaning nagging about his lack of a love life. As he stepped inside, the familiar aroma of rosemary and garlic hit him. But something felt off. His mom's voice called out from the dining room, a little too chipper. "Josh, sweetheart, you're just in time." When he entered, he froze. Three women, all stunning and very much strangers, sat at the table, smiling in his direction. His mother stood at the head of the table, looking far too pleased with herself. Mom? What's going on?" Josh asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Carol beamed. "Josh, meet Emily, Rachel, and Mia. They're here because, well, I took matters into my own hands. You've been single long enough, and I decided it's time you found someone special. These lovely ladies already know you, or at least know about you." Josh's jaw dropped. "You? What? Mom, this isn't The Bachelor." Emily, the poised brunette in a tailored blazer, chuckled softly. "Don't worry, Josh. We're not here to audition for your love. Carol just thought it might be fun for us to meet you." "Fun," Josh repeated, his tone flat. He turned to Rachel, a redhead with a warm smile. "And you're all okay with this?" Rachel shrugged. "Your mom's pretty persuasive. Besides, I think it's nice to put yourself out there." Mia, a blonde with streaks of pink in her hair, grinned mischievously. "I mean, how could we say no? Carol made cookies." Josh ran a hand through his hair, unsure whether to laugh or bolt. "Mom, I can't believe you did this. What made you think this was a good idea?" Carol crossed her arms, her smile unyielding. "Because, darling, you've been stuck in your routine for years. Work, gym, repeat. I thought you could use a little push." Josh sighed and looked at the three women, who, despite the absurdity of the situation, didn't seem to hate being there. Maybe his mom was onto something, or maybe this was the most awkward dinner of his life waiting to happen. "Fine," he said, throwing up his hands. "Let's eat." As they sat down, the conversation started tentatively, with Carol playing the enthusiastic moderator. "So, Emily," Carol began, "tell Josh what you do for a living." "I'm an attorney," Emily said, her tone confident but not overbearing. "I specialize in family law." Josh raised an eyebrow. "That must be intense." "It can be," Emily admitted, "but I like solving problems. Helping people through tough times is rewarding." "Impressive," Josh said, genuinely intrigued. "But do you ever get time to relax?" Emily smirked. "I make time. A good work-life balance is important." Next, Carol turned to Rachel. "And Rachel, you're a teacher, right?" "Yes," Rachel said, her face lighting up. "I teach high school English. Literature is my passion. Connecting with students through stories is the best part of my job." Josh nodded. "What's your favorite book to teach?" "To Kill a Mockingbird, hands down," Rachel said without hesitation. "It always sparks the best discussions." Finally, Carol gestured to Mia, who leaned back in her chair, looking relaxed. "And Mia here is an artist." "Freelance artist," Mia corrected with a grin. "Translation, I make art and hope people buy it." Josh laughed. "What kind of art?" "Abstract, mostly. Big, bold pieces with lots of color. I also dabble in murals and street art when I can." "Sounds unconventional," Josh said. "Unconventional is just another word for fun," Mia replied, her eyes sparkling. By the end of the meal, Josh was surprised to find himself enjoying the company. Sure, his mom's meddling was mortifying, but each woman was interesting in her own way. As the evening wound down, Carol clapped her hands together. "Well, this has been delightful. Josh, I'll leave it up to you to decide how you'd like to proceed." No pressure, of course. Josh shot her a look that said, "Seriously," but kept his cool. "Thanks, Mom. I'll think about it." As the women said their goodbyes and filed out one by one, Mia turned back and winked. "Good luck figuring this out, Josh. You're gonna need it." When the door finally closed, Josh turned to Carol. "Mom, what were you thinking?" She smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, darling, life needs a little nudge. Trust me, you'll thank me later." Josh groaned, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if she was right. Josh paced around his apartment, staring at the neatly written list his mom had left him before the dinner ended. Emily, Rachel, Mia. Each name felt like a question mark looming over his head. How had he ended up in this bizarre situation? After a few minutes of overthinking, he finally grabbed his phone. "Fine," he muttered. "Might as well see this through." He texted each of them, suggesting casual meetups to get to know them better. Josh's first meeting was with Emily. They agreed to grab coffee at a sleek downtown cafe, the kind of place where lawyers and executives looked like they belonged. Emily arrived exactly on time, her blazer sharp and her presence commanding. Josh, she greeted with a firm handshake and a smile. I appreciate you reaching out. Of course, he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. I figured we should start with something simple. No pressure. Emily raised an eyebrow as she sipped her black coffee. No pressure, huh? Coming from the guy who was clearly blindsided at dinner. Josh laughed. You caught that, huh? Hard to miss. Emily leaned back, her expression softening. But I'll admit, Carol has good intentions. She cares about you. The conversation shifted to work, and Emily's passion for her career was undeniable. She talked about the challenges of family law cases and the satisfaction of helping her clients. It sounds intense, Josh said. Does it ever get overwhelming? Sometimes, Emily admitted, but I thrive on structure and solving problems. It's who I am. Josh nodded. That's impressive, but what do you do for fun? You know, when you're not saving the world one legal case at a time. Emily smirked. I box, keeps me grounded and lets me blow off steam. Boxing? Seriously? Josh asked, surprised. Don't let the blazer fool you, Emily said, grinning. The date ended on a high note. But as Josh walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's world was a little too polished, a little too perfect. The following Saturday, Josh met Rachel at a park near her favorite coffee shop. She arrived wearing a floral dress and carrying a book in her hand. You brought a book to a date? Josh teased as they started walking. Rachel laughed. I wasn't sure if you'd show up. Always good to have a backup plan. Fair enough, Josh said, smiling. What are you reading? The Great Gatsby. I've read it a dozen times, but I always find something new. They talked about books as they strolled along the tree-lined paths, stopping occasionally to admire the view of a nearby lake. So, teaching high school, Josh said. That's got to be rewarding, right? Rachel nodded. It is. I love seeing the world through my students' eyes. They're so full of hope and ideas. But, Josh prompted, sensing a hesitation. Rachel sighed. It's hard when I see some of them struggling, at home, with school, with themselves. I wish I could do more. You're already doing a lot, Josh said earnestly. Rachel blushed slightly. Thanks. Most people don't really get it. The rest of the afternoon was easy, filled with light conversation and laughter. Yet as Rachel waved goodbye, Josh felt an odd sense of distance, as if she was still lost in her own world of books and dreams. Josh's final meeting was with Mia, who texted him an address to a street art festival. When he arrived, the air was electric with music, the scent of food trucks, and the vibrant energy of live painting. Mia spotted him and waved enthusiastically, a paintbrush in her hand and a smear of blue across her cheek. Glad you made it, she said, handing him a brush. Wait, what? Josh asked, bewildered. You're painting, Mia said matter-of-factly. No sitting on the sidelines with me. Josh hesitated but eventually joined in, dabbing paint onto a large canvas alongside Mia and other artists. This is chaotic, he said, laughing as Mia added a splash of yellow to his corner. Life's chaotic, Mia replied, her eyes sparkling. Might as well embrace it. They spent the rest of the evening exploring the festival, with Mia dragging Josh to try everything from fried Oreos to spray painting a public mural. You're different, Josh said as they sat on the curb, sharing a bag of kettle corn. Thanks, Mia said with a smirk. So are you. By the time Josh returned home that night, he felt exhausted but oddly content. Each woman had left an impression, yet none of them had felt like the perfect fit. Great, he muttered to himself. Now what? The list his mom had written still sat on his counter, staring back at him like a challenge. For the first time, Josh wondered if this wasn't just about choosing one of them. Maybe, he thought, it was about figuring out what he really wanted. Josh sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. The Notes app was open, displaying a growing list of pros and cons for Emily, Rachel, and Mia. He sighed, tapping his pen against the counter in frustration. Why is this so hard? He muttered, rubbing his temples. The truth was, each of them was incredible in her own way. But every time he tried to imagine a future with one of them, something felt off. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was his mom. Of course. Josh, Carol said cheerfully when he picked up, I've been thinking, why don't you come over for dinner tonight? We can talk. Josh groaned. Mom, I'm not ready to make a decision. I'm not asking for a decision, Carol said in her calm, slightly manipulative tone. I just want to talk. Besides, I'm making pot roast. Josh sighed. Fine, I'll be there at 7. When Josh arrived, Carol greeted him with her usual bright smile and a plate of appetizers. Sit, she said, gesturing to the couch. Okay, Mom. Spill? Josh said, crossing his arms. Why am I really here? Carol sat down across from him, her expression softening. Josh, I've been watching you struggle with this, and I think I know why. You're looking at this as if it's a test, like there's one right answer and two wrong ones. Isn't that what this is? Josh asked, exasperated. No, sweetheart, Carol said gently. Love isn't about finding someone perfect. Therefore, it's about finding someone who's right for you. Someone who makes you want to be better, who you're willing to work for, even when things aren't easy. Josh frowned. But how do I know who that is? Carol smiled knowingly. You don't. Not at first. But let me ask you this. When you think about these women, are you focusing on what they bring to your life or on what you're willing to give them? Josh blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? Love isn't just about what you get, Josh, Carol explained. It's about what you're willing to give. Are you ready to support someone else's dreams? To stick around when things get hard? To let someone see the messy parts of you? Josh leaned back, her words sinking in. He hadn't thought of it that way before. Carol leaned forward, resting a hand on his knee. Josh, you're a good man. Any of these women would be lucky to have you. But it's not about impressing them or being impressed. It's about connection, and you'll never find that if you're busy trying to score them on a checklist. Josh stared at her, a mix of frustration and gratitude bubbling inside him. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, Carol said with a laugh. It's messy and complicated and sometimes downright infuriating. But when it's right, it's worth it. That night, as Josh drove home, Carol's words played over and over in his mind. Maybe he'd been looking at this all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about finding the perfect woman, but about being ready to give himself fully to the right one. When he got home, he sat down and opened his notes app again. This time, instead of listing pros and cons, he wrote down what he truly wanted in a relationship. By the time he closed the app, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel the pressure to choose. Instead, he felt something else, a strange, tentative hope. Josh sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the blank email drafts on his laptop screen. His mom's words had stuck with him, reshaping how he thought about everything. He realized he needed to do something difficult but necessary. Be honest with Emily, Rachel, and Mia. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This is going to be awkward, he muttered, opening a new email draft. The next day, he decided to meet each woman in person. First up was Emily. They met at the same downtown cafe where they'd had their first conversation. As always, she arrived on time, looking composed in a tailored blazer. Josh, she greeted with a polite smile, sitting down across from him. You look tense. What's going on? Josh took a deep breath. Emily, I wanted to talk to you because I think you deserve honesty. Her smile faded slightly, but she nodded. Go on. I think you're amazing. Your drive, your intelligence, the way you handle everything with such grace. But I don't feel like I'm the right person for you. Emily tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Why do you say that? It's hard to explain, Josh said carefully. I just feel like we're too different. Your world is so structured and focused, and I don't know if I can keep up with that. For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then she let out a small laugh. You know, I kind of expected this. Josh blinked. Yed? Yes, she admitted, a hint of a smile returning. Don't get me wrong. I think you're a great guy, but I could tell you weren't completely comfortable in my world. And honestly, I think I need someone who thrives in it, not someone who feels out of place. Josh exhaled, relief washing over him. Thank you for understanding. Emily extended a hand, her professionalism never wavering. Good luck, Josh. I hope you find what you're looking for. His next meeting was with Rachel at the park. She was sitting on a bench, reading as usual, when he approached. Hey, he said, sitting down beside her. Rachel closed her book and smiled warmly. Hey, what's up? Josh hesitated, his nerves getting the better of him for a moment. I need to talk to you about something. Rachel's smile faltered. That sounds serious. It is, Josh admitted. Rachel, you're incredible. You're kind, thoughtful, and so passionate about what you do, but I don't think I'm the person who can give you what you need." Rachel's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "I see. It's not you," Josh said quickly. "You deserve someone who's as deeply connected to your world as you are, someone who can share in your dreams. I just feel like I'd be holding you back." Rachel looked down at her book for a moment, then back at him. "You know, I had a feeling this might be coming. I could tell you were trying to figure things out, and I respect that. It's better to be honest now than to force something that doesn't feel right." Josh felt a wave of gratitude for her understanding. "Thank you, Rachel. Really?" She gave him a small smile. "Good luck, Josh. And don't stop looking for someone who makes your heart feel full." Last was Mia. She texted him a location that turned out to be a quiet rooftop bar overlooking the city. She was already there when he arrived, sipping a cocktail and watching the skyline. "Fancy meeting you here," Mia said with a grin as he sat down. Josh chuckled nervously. "Mia, I need to talk to you about something." Her grin faded slightly and she tilted her head. "Uh-oh, this sounds serious." "It is," Josh admitted. "Mia, you're incredible. You have this energy that lights up every room you walk into. But I don't think I'm the right guy for you." Mia raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" "I feel like we're on completely different wavelengths," Josh said. "You're spontaneous, fearless, always ready to dive into the unknown. I'm not like that, and I don't want to hold you back." Mia studied him for a moment, then smiled, a real genuine smile. "You know what, Josh? I respect that. It takes guts to admit when something doesn't feel right." Josh blinked, surprised. "You're taking this better than I expected. Life's too short to waste time on things that aren't meant to be," Mia said, raising her glass. "No hard feelings. I hope you find your perfect fit." By the time Josh returned home, he felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Saying goodbye hadn't been easy, but it felt like the right thing to do. As he sat down on the couch, his mom's words echoed in his mind. Love isn't about finding the perfect person. It's about being ready to give yourself fully. For the first time in weeks, Josh felt like he was finally starting to understand. And though he didn't know what the future held, he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to find out. The rain was coming down in soft sheets as Josh ducked into a small, cozy bookstore tucked into the corner of the street. He hadn't planned on stopping, but the storm had other ideas. He shook off the droplets from his jacket and glanced around, taking in the quiet charm of the shop. Rows of bookshelves created narrow aisles, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. "Can I help you find something?" A warm, melodic voice asked. Josh turned to see a woman standing behind the counter, her hair loosely tied back with a few strands escaping. She wore a cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big and had a smile that instantly put him at ease. Her name tag read Sarah. "Uh, just waiting out the rain," Josh said awkwardly. "But maybe I'll look around." Sarah nodded. "Feel free. We've got some rare finds over in the corner if that's your thing." Josh wandered over to the section she'd pointed to and began scanning the titles. It didn't take long for him to lose himself among the shelves. He pulled out an old hardcover copy of The Catcher in the Rye, thumbing through the pages. "That's a classic," Sarah said, suddenly appearing beside him. Josh glanced up. "Yeah, I've read it a few times. Something about Holden's cynicism always stuck with me." Sarah smiled. "It's funny, isn't it? How a character so jaded can still feel so relatable. Like he's just trying to figure it all out, like the rest of us." Josh chuckled. "Yeah, exactly. It's like he's saying what we're all too afraid to admit." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, moving from books to music to the quirks of city life. Josh was struck by how natural it all felt. No awkward pauses, no pressure to impress. Just two people enjoying each other's company. "You work here full time?" Josh asked after a while. "Mostly," Sarah said. "It's a family shop. My parents opened it years ago, but I've been running it since they retired. I love it here. It's quiet, simple. People come in and find little pieces of themselves in the books they pick up." Josh smiled. "That's poetic," Sarah laughed softly. "I guess it is. What about you? What do you do?" "I work in tech," Josh said. "Not nearly as poetic, mostly staring at screens and solving problems that didn't exist 10 years ago." "Sounds stressful," Sarah said, tilting her head. "It can be," Josh admitted, "but it's also rewarding in its own way, like solving puzzles." The rain eventually let up, but Josh didn't leave right away. They kept talking, and by the time he finally glanced at his watch, an hour had passed. I should probably get going, he said reluctantly. Sarah nodded but looked a little disappointed. It was nice talking to you. Not many people come in and actually want to have a conversation these days. Josh hesitated for a moment, then pulled out his phone. Would you want to grab coffee sometime? You know, outside of the bookstore? Sarah's face lit up. I'd like that. She wrote her number on a scrap of paper and handed it to him. Just don't lose it. I might hold it against you. Josh laughed. I'll guard it with my life. As he walked back to his car, Josh felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. There was something about Sarah, something genuine and unforced. She didn't try to impress him or fit into some mold. She was just herself, and that was enough. When he got home, he placed the scrap of paper on his nightstand and sat down on his bed, a small smile on his face. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't overthinking. He wasn't making a list or analyzing pros and cons. He was just looking forward to seeing her again. Josh stood outside the cafe, holding two steaming cups of coffee. The crisp autumn air carried a faint scent of cinnamon and fallen leaves. He spotted Sarah walking toward him, her cardigan replaced with a light jacket and a scarf loosely wrapped around her neck. She smiled when she saw him, her cheeks slightly flushed from the cold. Two coffees? She teased. Trying to impress me already? Josh chuckled and handed her one. Impress? No, but ensuring caffeine happiness? Absolutely. They walked along the tree-lined street, their steps in sync. The cafe was near the waterfront, and the soft sound of waves lapping against the shore added a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. So, Josh started, taking a sip of his coffee, you said your family opened the bookstore. Did you always know you'd take it over? Sarah thought for a moment, her gaze on the horizon. Not really. I went to college thinking I'd become a teacher or maybe a writer. But when my parents decided to retire, it just felt right. Like the store was more than just a place. It's a part of who I am. Josh smiled. That's rare, you know. Most people spend years trying to figure out what feels right. And you? Sarah asked, looking at him. Did you always want to work in tech? Josh shook his head. Not at all. I actually wanted to be a photographer. But somewhere along the line, I convinced myself that dreams like that weren't practical. Tech was safe, reliable. So here I am. Do you regret it? Josh paused. Sometimes, but I think it's more about finding the balance, doing what pays the bills, and finding time for what I love. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think we all need that balance. Otherwise, life just feels like a to-do list. They continued walking, their conversation drifting between lighthearted topics and deeper reflections. Josh found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He told Sarah about his mom's matchmaking dinner, and she burst out laughing. Wait, she said between giggles, your mom invited 3 women to dinner without telling you? Yup, Josh said, grinning despite himself. It was like a reality show I didn't sign up for. And you went along with it? Sarah teased, her eyes sparkling. Well, I didn't want to ruin her fun, Josh admitted. But honestly, it helped me realize a lot about what I want and what I don't want. Sarah's laughter softened into a smile. And what is it that you want, Josh Harper? Josh hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He looked at her, realizing that the answer was standing right in front of him. I want something real, he said finally. No games, no checklists, just connection. Sarah held his gaze for a moment, her smile softening. Good answer. They ended the evening sitting on a bench overlooking the water. The sky had turned a deep shade of indigo, with stars beginning to peek through the clouds. This has been nice, Sarah said, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. Yeah, Josh agreed. It really has. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet felt comfortable, like they didn't need to fill the space with words. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. You know, I don't do this often. Josh raised an eyebrow. Walk by the waterfront? Talk to strangers? Accept free coffee? She laughed softly. Date. I'm not usually open to this kind of thing. Josh tilted his head. Why not? I guess I've just been focused on other things, Sarah admitted. The store, my family, my friends. It's easier to keep things simple. I get that, Josh said. I think I've been doing the same thing in my own way, keeping life predictable, safe. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his. And now? Josh took a deep breath. Now, I think I'm ready for something different. Sarah smiled, her cheeks dimpling. Me too. As Josh drove home that night, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the same nervous excitement he'd felt during his dates with Emily, Rachel, or Mia. This was something steadier, deeper, a quiet certainty that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Josh wasn't questioning what came next. He wasn't making a list or second guessing his feelings. He was just happy. The Saturday sun poured golden light over the city, and Josh found himself standing in front of Sarah's bookstore again. He wasn't sure what exactly had brought him back so soon. It had only been a couple of days since their walk by the waterfront, but something about her had drawn him in. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Sarah was behind the counter, stacking a pile of books. When she looked up and saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made Josh's heart skip a beat. "Josh Harper," she said playfully, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Josh grinned. "What can I say? You've got a great coffee selection here." Sarah laughed. "Oh, is that it? The coffee?" "Well, that, and maybe I was hoping you'd have more book recommendations," Josh said, leaning casually on the counter. She arched an eyebrow. "More Holden Caulfield angst, or are you ready to branch out?" "Surprise me," he said. Sarah walked around the counter and led him to a section of the store he hadn't noticed before. It was tucked in the corner, marked by a small wooden sign that read, "Local Authors." "These are some of my favorites," she said, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "There's something special about stories rooted in places you know, written by people who've walked the same streets." Josh picked up a thin paperback with a hand-drawn cover. "You're not secretly one of these authors, are you?" Sarah smirked. "Not yet. Maybe someday." "What would you write about?" Josh asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing over a book's spine. "Probably something about family. The messiness of it, the love, the expectations, how it shapes us, for better or worse." Josh nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds personal." "It is," Sarah admitted, her voice softening. "My family's a big part of who I am. My parents, the bookstore, the way they always encouraged me to chase my dreams. But not everything's perfect, you know?" Josh leaned against the shelf, sensing there was more she wanted to say. "What do you mean?" Sarah sighed and looked away for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. "My dad passed away a few years ago. It was sudden and, well, it changed everything. The bookstore became my way of keeping a part of him alive." "I'm sorry," Josh said quietly. Sarah gave him a small, bittersweet smile. "Thanks. It's gotten easier over time, but it still hits me sometimes. Like when I see a book I know he'd love, or hear a song he used to hum." Josh thought about his own life, his mom's constant involvement, her matchmaking efforts. It had always felt overwhelming, but now he saw it differently. She was there, pushing him because she cared, because she wanted him to be happy. "I think your dad would be proud," he said finally, "of the store of you." Sarah blinked, her eyes glistening slightly. "Thank you, Josh. That means a lot." As the day went on, they continued to talk, moving from the bookstore to a nearby cafe for lunch. They shared stories from their childhoods, laughing over embarrassing moments and swapping tales of first jobs and awkward crushes. Josh told her about his mom and the infamous matchmaking dinner. "She really brought 3 women to dinner without telling you?" Sarah asked, nearly choking on her coffee. "Yep," Josh said, shaking his head. "She was convinced it was the only way to save me from myself." Sarah laughed. "Sounds like she really cares about you, even if her methods are unconventional." "She does," Josh admitted. "And honestly, I think it helped me realize what I'm looking for, or maybe who I'm looking for." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at her coffee. "And are you any closer to figuring that out?" Josh smiled, his eyes meeting hers. "Yeah, I think I am." By the time they parted ways, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. Josh walked her back to the bookstore, and as they stood outside, he felt a pull to say something more. "Sarah," he said, his voice quieter now, "I've really enjoyed spending time with you. You make everything feel easy, like I don't have to try so hard." Sarah tilted her head, her expression soft. "I feel the same way." Josh took a step closer, his heart pounding. "I don't know where this is going, but I want to find out. With you." For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. Then she smiled, a real, genuine smile that made Josh feel like he'd just stepped into the sunlight. "I'd like that," she said. As they said goodbye, Josh felt lighter than he had in weeks. For the first time, he wasn't looking back or overthinking. For the first time, he was excited about what lay ahead. Josh felt a knot in his stomach as he drove toward his mom's house. The thought of introducing Sarah to Carol was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Carol had been the architect of his matchmaking disaster, but in a way, it had led him to this moment. Now he was bringing someone home, not because his mom had chosen her, but because he had. Next to him, Sarah sat quietly, looking out the window. "You're sure your mom's okay with this?" she asked, turning to him with a curious smile. "She's more than okay," Josh assured her. "When I told her I was bringing someone, she practically screamed into the phone." Sarah laughed. "Well, that's a good sign, but she sounds intense." Josh chuckled. "She's passionate, that's for sure, but she means well. Just brace yourself for a lot of questions." "Noted," Sarah said with a grin, though a flicker of nervousness crossed her face. When they arrived, Carol was already at the door, and her arms spread wide in welcome. "Josh!" she called, pulling him into a quick hug before turning to Sarah. "And this must be Sarah. Oh my goodness, you're even lovelier than he described." Sarah blushed, extending a hand. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Harper." "Please call me Carol," she said, waving off the formality. "Come in, come in. I've been dying to meet the woman who's turned my son into such a glowing mess." "Mom," Josh groaned, rolling his eyes. Sarah laughed, clearly amused. "I'll take that as a compliment." Inside, the house smelled of roasted chicken and fresh-baked bread. Carol had gone all out, setting the table with her best china and arranging a bouquet of fresh flowers in the center. "Wow," Sarah said, taking it all in. "This is beautiful." "Oh, it's nothing," Carol said, brushing it off, but clearly pleased. "I just wanted everything to be perfect. Now sit, sit. Dinner's almost ready." As they ate, Carol peppered Sarah with questions, her curiosity as boundless as Josh had warned. "So, Sarah, Josh tells me you run a bookstore. That must be so rewarding," Carol said, passing the mashed potatoes. "It is," Sarah said. "It's a small business, but I love it. There's something magical about connecting people with stories that resonate with them." Carol nodded approvingly. "And do you find time for yourself? Hobbies? Friends?" "Sometimes," Sarah admitted with a laugh. "The bookstore keeps me busy, but I try to make time for the little things, like reading by the fire or taking long walks." "That's wonderful," Carol said, her eyes twinkling. "Josh could use more of that balance in his life." "Mom?" Josh interjected, giving her a look. "What?" Carol said innocently. "I'm just saying, she sounds like a good influence on you." Sarah grinned. "Well, if it helps, he's been a pretty good influence on me too." Josh glanced at her, his heart swelling. After dinner, they moved to the living room for coffee. Carol brought out a tin of homemade cookies, which Sarah immediately complimented. "These are amazing," Sarah said, taking another bite. "Secret family recipe," Carol said proudly. "And now that I like you, maybe I'll share it with you someday." Sarah laughed. "I'll hold you to that." As the conversation continued, Josh felt a sense of ease settle over him. His mom and Sarah were getting along better than he could have hoped. The evening felt light, warm, and full of laughter. When it was time to leave, Carol hugged Sarah tightly. "It was such a pleasure meeting you, Sarah. I hope we'll see you again soon." "Likewise," Sarah said sincerely. "Thank you for such a lovely evening." As they walked to the car, Josh glanced at Sarah. "So, how was it?" Sarah smiled. "Your mom's wonderful. A little intense, but in the best way. I can see where you get it from." Josh raised an eyebrow. "Get what?" "That warmth, that ability to make people feel welcome," Sarah said softly. Josh felt his cheeks heat. "Well, I'm glad you think so." On the drive home, Sarah reached over and took Josh's hand. "Your mom's great," she said. "And tonight felt right, like everything's starting to fall into place." Josh squeezed her hand, a quiet happiness settling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his life was exactly where it was meant to be. The crisp morning air greeted Josh as he parked his car outside Sarah's bookstore. He had been coming here more often lately, not just to see Sarah, though she was obviously the main reason, but also because the store itself had become a comforting space. Today, however, felt different. As he stepped inside, the soft jingle of the bell above the door announced his arrival. Sarah looked up from the counter, her face lighting up with a smile. Good morning, stranger, she said teasingly, brushing her hands against her apron. Couldn't stay away, could you? Josh grinned. Guilty as charged. But I come bearing gifts. He held up a paper bag, the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked pastries wafting from it. Sarah's eyes widened. Is that from Murphy's Bakery? She asked, practically drooling. The one and only, Josh said, handing her the bag. Thought we could have breakfast together. Unless you're busy. I can always make time for croissants, Sarah said, grabbing two mugs and motioning for Josh to follow her to the small seating area tucked in the corner of the store. They sat by the window, the morning sunlight streaming in and painting everything in warm hues. Sarah took a bite of her croissant and let out a small, contented sigh. Okay, she said, this officially makes you my favorite person today. Just today? Josh teased. Depends on what else you have up your sleeve, she shot back, grinning. They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, the world outside slowly waking up. Then Josh cleared his throat, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice. So, I've been thinking, he began, setting his coffee cup down. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression curious. Uh-oh, that sounds serious. Not serious, Josh said quickly, then corrected himself. Well, maybe a little serious. I want to know more about you, your life, your dreams, where you see yourself in the future. Sarah blinked, surprised by his earnestness. Wow, that's a lot to unpack over breakfast. Josh chuckled. Fair, but I'm curious. You're such an amazing person, and I feel like I'm only scratching the surface. Sarah smiled softly, setting her croissant down. Okay, let's see. The bookstore is obviously a big part of my life. I've always wanted to expand it. Add a cafe, host more events, maybe even start a book club for kids. Something that makes it a real community space. That sounds incredible, Josh said, genuinely impressed. Why haven't you done it yet? Sarah shrugged. Partly fear, partly time. It's hard to take a leap when you're used to steady ground, you know? I get that, Josh said. But I think you could pull it off. You're passionate and you've got the drive. I mean, look at what you've already built. Sarah's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her coffee. Thanks, Josh. That means a lot. What about outside the bookstore? Josh asked. What else do you dream about? Sarah hesitated, her eyes distant for a moment. I'd like to travel more, see places I've only read about, and someday I want to have a family, a home filled with love and laughter. Josh felt his heart skip a beat. He hadn't expected her to be so open, but it made him feel closer to her. That sounds perfect, he said softly. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his. And you, Josh? What do you dream about? Josh leaned back, considering her question. Honestly, for the longest time, I didn't know. I was so focused on doing what was expected, getting a stable job, checking all the right boxes, that I forgot to think about what I really wanted. But lately, I've been realizing that what I want is pretty simple. I want to build a life with someone who makes me happy, someone I can share everything with. Sarah's lips parted slightly, and a warm smile spread across her face. That's a good dream. They spent the rest of the morning talking, their conversation flowing effortlessly. By the time Josh left the bookstore, he felt like he had taken a big step forward, not just with Sarah, but in understanding himself. As he drove home, he couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a vague, distant concept. It felt real, tangible, and full of possibilities. And he knew Sarah would be a part of it. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun began to set over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Josh tightened his grip on the small velvet box in his pocket, his heart pounding. He glanced over at Sarah, who was walking beside him, her scarf fluttering lightly in the breeze. This view is amazing, Sarah said, her eyes scanning the horizon. You picked the perfect spot. I wanted it to be special, Josh replied, his voice steady despite the storm of nerves inside him. They reached a quiet clearing with a bench overlooking the valley below. The world seemed to fall silent, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. Josh gestured toward the bench. Let's sit for a bit, he said. Sarah smiled and took a seat, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck as the air grew cooler. Josh sat next to her, his hands clasped tightly together. You've been quiet today, Sarah noted, glancing at him. What's on your mind? Josh exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. A lot, actually. Mostly. How lucky I am to have you in my life. Sarah tilted her head, her eyes softening. Josh, that's sweet, but you don't have to get all mushy on me. He laughed nervously. I know, but I mean it. You've changed everything for me, Sarah. You make me see the world differently in ways I didn't even know I needed. Sarah's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. Josh, what's going on? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small box. Sarah's breath hitched as he opened it, revealing a delicate gold ring with a simple yet elegant diamond. I've been thinking about this for a while, Josh began, his voice shaking slightly. Sarah, you are everything I didn't know I was looking for. You're smart, kind, funny, and you have this incredible way of making the world feel brighter just by being in it. I can't imagine my life without you, and I don't want to. Sarah's eyes glistened as tears began to form. She covered her mouth with her hand, her gaze fixed on the ring. Sarah, Josh continued, his voice steadier now. Will you marry me? For a moment, Sarah didn't move. Then she nodded, her smile breaking through the tears. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, Josh, I'll marry you. Relief and joy washed over him as he slid the ring onto her finger. Sarah threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. I can't believe this, she said, her voice muffled. It's perfect. You're perfect. Josh laughed, pulling back to look at her. I'm far from perfect, but I promise to do everything I can to make you happy, always. Sarah cupped his face in her hands, her eyes shining. You already do. They stayed in the clearing a while longer, watching the sunset and talking about the future. Where do we even start? Sarah asked, looking at the ring on her finger as if she couldn't believe it was real. One step at a time, Josh said. We'll figure it out together. I like the sound of that, Sarah replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Josh felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. This moment, this person, it was everything he had ever wanted and more. And for the first time, the future felt not just hopeful, but truly bright. The sun streamed through the large bay windows of Carol's house as she bustled around the living room, adjusting flower arrangements and fussing over every detail. The small backyard wedding was set to begin in a few hours, and everything needed to be perfect. Josh! Carol called from the dining room, where she was rearranging a stack of napkins. Did you check on the caterers yet? And the chairs? Are they all perfectly aligned? Josh, already wearing his crisp navy suit, poked his head around the corner, a wry smile on his face. Mom, relax. Everything's fine. Sarah and I double-checked everything yesterday. Carol placed her hands on her hips, glaring at him playfully. Fine isn't good enough for my son's wedding. This has to be perfect. Josh walked over and gently rested his hands on her shoulders. It will be, Mom. You've done an amazing job. Now take a breath, okay? Carol sighed, but allowed herself a small smile. You're right. I just want everything to be as special as she is. Josh's smile softened. Me too. Meanwhile, Sarah was upstairs in one of the guest rooms, standing in front of a full-length mirror. Her dress was simple, yet elegant, with delicate lace detailing along the sleeves and neckline. She smoothed the fabric nervously as her maid of honor, her best friend Laura, fluffed the veil. You look stunning, Laura said, stepping back to admire her. Do I? Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. I feel like my heart's about to leap out of my chest, Laura laughed. That's normal. It's your wedding day. But honestly, Sarah, you've never looked happier. Sarah glanced at her reflection, her cheeks glowing and her eyes sparkling. I am happy. I can't believe this is really happening. Laura placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Josh is a great guy. He loves you. And from what I've seen, you bring out the best in each other. You've got nothing to worry about. Sarah nodded, taking a deep breath. Okay, let's do this. The ceremony was held in Carol's backyard, which had been transformed into a whimsical garden. White chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing an arch adorned with fresh flowers and twinkling fairy lights. A string quartet played softly as guests began to take their seats. Josh stood at the altar, his nerves betraying him as he adjusted his tie for the fifth time. His best man, his childhood friend Mark, nudged him. Relax, man, Mark said with a grin. You're about to marry the love of your life. You should be smiling, not sweating. Josh laughed nervously. Easy for you to say. You're not the one standing up here. Mark smirked. True, but if you faint, I promise to catch you. Before Josh could retort, the music shifted, and all heads turned toward the house. The The doors opened, and Sarah stepped out, her arm linked with her uncle's. Josh's breath caught in his throat. She looked radiant, her smile as bright as the sun overhead. For a moment, everything else faded. The guests, the music, even his nerves. All he could see was her. As Sarah walked down the aisle, she locked eyes with Josh, and a wave of calm washed over her. This was where she was meant to be. The ceremony itself was filled with laughter and heartfelt moments. The officiant shared a few light-hearted anecdotes about how Josh and Sarah had met, drawing chuckles from the guests. When it came time for the vows, Josh took Sarah's hands, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Sarah," he began, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've taught me what it means to truly love, to be vulnerable, and to grow. I promise to stand by your side through every high and every low, to laugh with you, to support your dreams, and to share mine with you. You are my heart, my home, and my everything." Tears shimmered in Sarah's eyes as she squeezed his hands. Taking a deep breath, she spoke her vows. "Josh, from the moment we met, you've made me feel seen, understood, and cherished. You've shown me that love isn't about perfection. It's about patience, kindness, and finding joy in the little things. I promise to be your partner, your biggest supporter, and your safe place. I love you, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." As they exchanged rings, the officiant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Josh, you may kiss your bride." Josh grinned, pulling Sarah close and kissing her as the guests erupted into cheers and applause. The reception was just as magical. Fairy lights twinkled above the dance floor as Josh and Sarah swayed to their first dance. Carol looked on with happy tears streaming down her face, dabbing at them with a tissue. Mark clinked his glass during the toasts, earning everyone's attention. "To Josh and Sarah," he began. "Two people who prove that sometimes life surprises you in the best possible ways. Here's to love, laughter, and a lifetime of happiness." Glasses clinked, laughter filled the air, and the evening stretched into a celebration filled with dancing, heartfelt moments, and endless joy. Later, as the night wound down, Josh and Sarah snuck away from the crowd to sit on the edge of the garden, watching the stars. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" Sarah asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Josh smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "Not in my wildest dreams, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Sarah looked up at him, her smile soft. "Me neither." And as they sat there, under the stars, surrounded by the love of their friends and family, Josh knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of their forever. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of their cozy apartment, casting a warm glow over the room. Josh woke to the sound of soft humming. He blinked a few times, smiling as he recognized the tune. It was Sarah, singing quietly in the kitchen. He got up, pulling on a sweatshirt, and followed the sound. There she was, standing at the stove, flipping pancakes. She wore one of his oversized shirts, her hair tied up messily, and she looked absolutely perfect. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," Josh said, leaning against the doorframe with a grin. Sarah turned, her face lighting up. "Good morning, Mr. Harper. You're just in time. Breakfast is almost ready." He walked over, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You married me," Sarah teased, turning her head to kiss him on the cheek. They sat at the small kitchen table, eating pancakes and sipping coffee. The atmosphere was easy, filled with the kind of quiet comfort that comes from being with someone who truly understands you. "So," Sarah began, cutting into her pancake, "what's the plan for today?" Josh shrugged. "I was thinking we could take it slow. Maybe a walk in the park, stop by the bookstore, and then just relax at home. Sound good?" "Perfect," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling. "But I was thinking we should start planning that little cafe we talked about for the store." Josh raised an eyebrow. "Are you serious?" "Why not?" Sarah said, her excitement growing. "It's something I've always wanted, and now I feel like I can actually do it. With your help, of course." Josh reached across the table, taking her hand. "I'm all in. Whatever you need, I'll be there every step of the way." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Josh. You always know how to make me feel like anything is possible." Later that afternoon, they strolled through the park, the crisp air carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Sarah held a notebook, jotting down ideas for the cafe as they walked. "What about calling it the Chapter Cafe?" Sarah suggested, looking up at him. Josh nodded thoughtfully. I like it. It ties into the bookstore, and it's got a nice ring to it. Sarah grinned. Okay, it's settled. Now we just need to figure out the menu, the layout, the permits. Josh laughed, cutting her off. One step at a time, Mrs. Overachiever. Sarah rolled her eyes, but laughed with him. Fine. But you'd better keep up, Mr. Harper. As the weeks turned into months, their lives began to take on a new rhythm. They worked on the cafe together, balancing the excitement of building something new with the challenges that came with it. The grand opening of the Chapter Cafe was a success. Friends, family, and loyal customers filled the space, marveling at the transformation. Carol was the first to give a speech, raising her coffee cup in a toast. To Josh and Sarah, she said, her voice filled with pride, you've created something truly special, and I couldn't be happier for you both. The applause was loud and genuine, and as Josh looked at Sarah, her eyes shining with joy, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought them to this moment. That night, after the cafe had closed and the last of the guests had left, Josh and Sarah sat on the counter, sharing a slice of cake. You know, Sarah said, leaning against him, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be married and running a cafe with the love of my life, I wouldn't have believed them. Same here, Josh admitted, but I'm glad life had other plans. Sarah looked up at him, her expression soft. Me too. Josh kissed her forehead, wrapping an arm around her. We've got a good thing going, don't we? The best, Sarah whispered. As they locked up the cafe and walked home hand in hand, the stars twinkling above them, Josh felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. Their journey hadn't been perfect. There had been doubts, challenges, and moments of uncertainty. But in the end, everything had fallen into place. And as they stepped into their home, laughing about something small and silly, Josh knew that this was just the beginning of a lifetime of love, laughter, and shared dreams.